I'm going to start a series of videos now on Krishnan's book, 2009. It's on killer robots, the legality and ethicality of autonomous weapons, AW, autonomous weapons. This is going to, we're in a series of videos, we'll dig into this book and look at exactly that. What are the ethical issues that arise when we start bringing in autonomous weapons, robotics, things like that? So these are fairly complicated terms, and we're going to put some more. We'll define them as we go along, or define them the best we can, because they're not exactly easy terms to nail down. So, here I'm talking about the introduction to the book, and he starts off. Well, it's always risky, though. Keep in mind to talk about the current state, especially when you're talking about high tech or science, because unless you're talking about the real foundations of these things, the cutting edge of them are. It's really fast moving front. But roughly, what we have over the several decades now is a trend towards the use of military robots. So let's look at first, why is that? Why is there such a rise? Why are so many people talking about this? Artificial intelligence, military stuff. What's the reason for talking about it? Well, there is this trend. So why is there this trend? Well, there's several answers, and they're not just strictly technological, because some of them, I want to, and I think the author points this out, and I think he's right, is that there are sociological trends that will drive certain kinds of developments in technology as well. So it's not the case that the technology is just simply self-perpetuating, although there are arguments to be made. In some ways it is, but that's not the entire story. So as I said at the outset, it's a complicated tale to tell. So why is there this trend? Well, first off, there's a shrinking pool of, quote unquote, human recruits, So now we start talking about recruiting among the human population. Well, what's going on? Well, there have been numerous studies showing that by and large, certain organizations are having a harder time recruiting from the general population. And the military is no different. It's another kind of organization. Churches talk about the same thing, that it used to be more people went into holy orders, and those were for a variety of reasons, for education, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if a lot of the opportunities that are given through a military, like for education or things like that, that are achievable elsewhere, well, it's not hard to figure out that people with the more options that are out there, the harder it will be for each of those organizations to attract the same numbers of people. Military is no different. So, and also shifting attitudes as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the shifting attitudes are, with the public's view of military casualties. So what does that mean? Well, we tend now think about when you go back and you look at previous wars, like especially like World War I and World War II. On a given Tuesday, they would often post the casualties, and they were just astoundingly high, just shocking to our contemporary eyes. We're just amazed at just how many people would die in a given battle on a Tuesday afternoon, and we just don't. The public just doesn't tolerate that anymore. Think about how often. If you go and you travel and you'll see, like, from huge cemeteries in Europe, and there's lots of, like, I have an uncle that's buried in one of them over there. They didn't bring all these soldiers that died in battle. They didn't bring them back. They were buried over there. There were so many. So, and often now, and I'm speaking from Canada, we bring soldiers home that didn't survive. So things are different in terms of the public's attitude towards death in general on the battlefield, and the repercussions of deaths that occur as a result of what's going on the battlefield in various civilian populations. So it's a big, complicated story. So the public's view of military casualties, just in the large sense of everything connected with war, it's changing, and people are seemingly, as some scholars have pointed out, far less tolerant of this. Wars have to be fought in a much stricter and perhaps less violent manner, if you want to put it that way, but at least where casualty rates must be brought down. So that's another change. And why does that? Well, if you have robots doing the job, you're not going to have human casualties in the same way. And some people say that even, and we'll look at this later, that even military robots can decrease collateral damage in terms of human casualties as well. So soldiers that are sort of robotic soldiers would be less likely to even commit war crimes and things like that. So that's all fitting into what people argue is that part of this trend. Doesn't mean the trend is right. It's just these are some of the arguments that are, or causes of this emerging trend. And there's not really a debate that there is this trend. The question is whether or not it's a good thing. That's a different question. But that there's a trend looks like it is to be the case, and we can try and figure out why. Okay, so you have the shrinking pool of humans. I haven't even talked about the development of technology as an internal motivating force. That's there. The public's changing view of military casualties, economic factors. So not only is it cheaper in human life, like less costly in terms of human life, but it's also less costly to run a military that's more high tech, right? And we may hear of huge costs like startup for certain projects. Well, that's fine. But you don't have, as Krishnan points out, there's no such thing as a robot pension plan. There's no such thing as really like robot hospitals. You might have to repair them, but if a human is badly hurt, well, you have to tend to them immediately. If a robot is damaged and you can't get to it, you could store it for a while, and you don't have to store it like where you have to keep it alive or anything like that. So there's a lot of associated costs dealing with technology that would be much cheaper in the long run. It might be very expensive in some ways, but think about the costs. You can go and look through statistics of how expensive it is to develop a piece of hardware for the military. High-tech hardware, it might be very expensive, but to develop a fighter pilot, a human fighter pilot, to train him or her from the minute he or she walks in the door until they're flying a fighter plane, it's just enormously expensive to do all that training, and very little of that training. Very little of the actual flight would be in battle. Most of it would be training and maintaining and honing the skills. So humans are very expensive in warfare as well. And when you start factoring in, looking after not just hospitals for people that have been injured in war, but long-term, think about militaries around the world often have problems with looking after veterans, how expensive that is. If you really want to take care of all the injuries that result from war, not just physical, but mental and all the ramifications of war, it is incredibly expensive to fight wars using human beings. So again, this is another factor in sort of like war would be cheaper, or at least less costly in a variety of ways. We'll talk a little bit more of that, and hence the trend towards the more military robots, more autonomous weapons. So there's several answers. That's just starting the case. Now I've used the word, as you see, robots, right? What's a robot? Well, a robot is part of, we'll think of it under a larger sense of some kind of autonomous weapon. It's not really easy to define all these things because there's a lot of different kinds of technologies that go into, automated and autonomous weapons. And it's not always easy to distinguish autonomous weapons from other types of weapons and systems. But autonomous weapons are distinct, one can say, in their overall goal. The goal is to substantially reduce and possibly, or at least move towards eliminating the human operator in the system. And so these are programmable. We'll look more at a definition of a robot in a bit, but there's some sort of intelligence going on here. So intelligence, so of course, as I pointed out in some earlier videos, like it's very difficult to nail down what intelligence means, but some kind of way that the system can react in an autonomous fashion to its environment, and that would allow them to be counted as autonomous weapons. The focus of this study in this book is to look at robots, basically. And again, we haven't really defined that term, but that's coming up. And so not other kinds of, like nanotechnology and things like that, or bioweapons. Those kinds of weapons, too, can be programmable. So they will have an autonomous aspect as well. Now, of course, when we think about, robots have been the subject of Hollywood movies, like the famous one of the last, 20, 30 years has been basically kind of like a Terminator thing. You build a sort of a super robot or a super soldier that's robotic or whatever in that kind of autonomous mechanical sense, and you're going to get something that is incredibly dangerous and or at least potentially incredibly dangerous. That you build it and it's going to get out of control and to do that kind of stuff is potentially flirting with some kind of disaster. And then if one country builds something like that, other countries are going to try and build it. So it's just going to get worse and worse, and you'll have a robotic autonomous weapons arms race, and this is going to be something catastrophic for humanity. Now, the author here wants to take an approach that probably he would say is a balanced approach that just simply saying no, don't do it, you're going to get Terminators. This is ostrich behavior, sticking your head in the sand and no, we're not going to do that. He wants to argue that autonomous weapons can be both part of a progress to actually humanizing war, right? So making war somehow less brutal or less violent. Now, again, we've seen that. That's the whole idea of the just war tradition, is to make war a little bit less brutal so that when war does break out, as opposed to completely breaking out an unregulated war, just anything goes on the battlefield, it's like, okay, well, we try and avoid war the best we can. And when it happens, we put some parameters on it such that the parameters help to bring the conflict to an earlier end than otherwise if you had no parameters. So the whole idea of just war theory is, shall we say, is the spirit or the animus behind what the author is doing here, is that it's possible that, autonomous warfare, robotic warfare is a kind of expression of just war theory, in the sense that it could make something that is horrible, war, into something a little less horrible and a little less catastrophic for humans. So again, it's trying to say, well, we don't have to be alarmists about this. These autonomous weapons might make something that's terrible a little less terrible. But of course, these are, serious. This is serious business, building basically building robots that are capable of violence and making decisions about engaging, that these entities would make decisions about engaging in violence that are independent of us. The whole idea of autonomous weaponry is just that it would be violence that's being perpetrated by machines that's independent of a human controller. So it's a fairly serious thing to think about, and it could go extremely awry if it's not taken seriously. So not to bury your head, but not to go full force, but to have kind of, as I said, this sort of just war infused spirit. Although the author doesn't use that term, but I think that's, again, the sort of the spirit behind when you start talking about accepting that war might be part of the human story, but you try and mitigate it as much as you can. So which one? Like, what are we going to get? Are we going to get robots that humanize a war, or are we going to get Terminators? Which one? Which one's going to prevail? Well, he's after going through a number of issues through the chapters, he's going to eventually reach a conclusion that it's something that can be regulated, and that's the only way that you're going to prevent Terminators type robots and reap the benefits that from here that you could get by allowing autonomous weapons. So you might humanize war a little bit. It's an odd expression, but and yet not end up with Terminators. So it is kind of, again, sort of the just war position. It's the last resort, but sometimes maybe humans, eventually we find ourselves in situations where differences are going to be settled on the battlefield. And if that's going to happen, then again, according to the spirit of just war, the just war tradition is to do it in the quickest and most ethical way and bring the hostilities to an end as fast as you can. All right. So we're stuck, he says, like no matter what, you're stuck with having to make these ethical decisions. So in a sense, even if we build these machines, we're still responsible. We don't completely escape responsibility of it. But as we'll see later on, questions of responsibility become a lot more puzzling when you bring in autonomous weapons, because now you are saying that these weapons are going to go off and kind of do their own thing. And if they're truly autonomous, their own thing may be doing stuff that that the programmers don't see in advance. And so, how are the programmers responsible for that? Not an easy question to answer. So I'll just conclude here by saying on page 4, there's a summary of the book's chapters. You can get an overview of the book. And on page 4 and on to page 5, there's a useful glossary. So some terminology is laid out. I'll talk a little bit about some terminology in the next video. But there you go. There's the setting of the story. So let's dive in.